Okay, let's see now. Okay, it shows here that I've got audio, so there we go. Okay, let's see now. That's what it maybe about 15 seconds or so. Do y'all need light? I mean, I guess we need light. I don't know. Now, half the time you never know which switch turns on what. These two switches sometimes work and sometimes don't. Okay, there we go. Okay, so today we're going to do a history lesson. This is weird. This is being the weirdest lecture you probably ever had. Half of it I'm making up, so I'm going to just warn you. So, olden days. I guess that's how you spell olden days. In the olden days, okay, so you look in old ancient literature and you'll find a measurement called a cubit. It turns out they've determined that was about 18 inches. Then you go look that on, is it called Wikipedia or Wikipedia or something like that? You go look at it, and then in the description they'll talk about, a palm is this, so they talk about a palm, and then they talk about something else. Something about, okay, so a cubit is something like from here to here. So people used to go around measuring stuff this way. And so obviously they had a foot. So they created this thing, so foot. Now, a foot in our world is 12 inches. Now, I'm going to make a crazy, this is absolutely, don't ever do this, but if you look, a person that is 6 foot 1 inch statistically has a foot that's 12 inches. If you get shorter, your feet get shorter statistically. Now, if you draw it on a plot, of course, there's a lot of random variation. So if that's the case, in olden days, everybody was 6 foot 1 inch tall. So isn't that crazy? Or is it? I'm just making that up. See, I'm just trying to make you think. But in the olden days, these were the units of measure. This one didn't take off. I mean, you ever use cubits in physics or anything? So and then there's a palm, and a palm was like a weird, 7 point something inches. It was very weird. So people used to go around measuring stuff like that. Now, so we're going to say in olden days, this is okay. We're going to say a foot's about 12 inches. So we're back in, so maybe we're about 5,000 BC, okay? When people were apparently less smart, but actually they were smarter than we are. We have a problem in our own, what is this, 2023? Oh no, it's not 2033. So we're AD, and we, AB. See, I told you this was going south. So AD, and we suffer from a very serious mental condition called egotism, or we'll just say ego. And that's not ego like the car. They got an ego, electric go. There's a new company. It's called Ego. I love it when it goes down the thing. So we think these people are stupid. Okay, but I show you some cases where, in fact, they're actually smarter than you think. So we have to change I think we have to change our view towards the ye olden days. But in ye olden days, they had that. Well, also in ye olden days, what happened? Why did they even care? You're going around and you're buying, all you were doing is trying to survive, so you were surviving. And we just call it serve. So you're serving, or you're surviving. How did you survive? Well, you make sure you're not dead. That's the first thing. How do you not die? You eat. You sleep, you do things like that. So you got to have food. So let's say you're not a great hunter, but maybe you can build some stuff to sell to a hunter, So you got to have commerce. So you got to have that. They didn't have dollar bills, but if I draw this up here, we're talking about money. So everything happened back in ye olden days to have money or cash or some sort of gold or something to actually do commerce. So somebody kills this is a terrible drawing, but here's a deer pelt or something, and there's a tiger. So the dude's going to go out and hunt, and I'm going to go hunt in the Alps. I need something to wear. Well, how big is it? Well, if this is 30 inches across, it's going to be more valuable than if it's 10 inches across. So somebody had to measure. So I'm just making this stuff up now. So they lay the pelt over, and they're walking on it to measure. Okay, so that's probably why feet became. I'm just visualizing the past as it probably did occur. So you're measuring, you lay down your pelt, you're walking over it, you're like, okay, this pelt's worth so many bricks. Well, what kind of brick is it? Well, they had gold, they had silver, but they probably had other things like granite also. So you're trying to figure out, well, how much granite does this thing? Well, the dude could calculate it by walking all over it and figure out its width, and its height. Just approximately, they probably didn't know square area, but they might have. Actually, if you look back, some of the area calculations were way, way back, way before this. So they're doing this. So somebody's got to weigh the thing. So some guy you ever seen Monty Python? You ever seen that? You ever seen the guy where she's a witch? You ever seen that?
Yeah.
So he comes in, he's like, well, and then King Arthur comes up, well, what weighs the same as a witch? What was it? It was wood, wasn't it? So if she weighs more than wood, or a duck, wasn't it a duck? So then she's a witch. And so what are they doing? They had this big thing, and they weighed stuff. Well, first they put the witch in there, and then they was it a duck or a piece of wood?
I think it was a goose. Was
it a goose? Okay. So then you put a goose in there, so you had something to offset her weight. Well, back in the olden days, this is a fairy tale. Well, we love that because now we know what these devices they used back then. So I don't know. So I'm just making this up. So there's some dude walks around. Okay, he has a big neck, obviously, and he's a minister of weights and measures. Okay, so weights and measures. So he has a big plaque on him that's weights and measures. Wears it around his neck. I'm making this up. So, the storytelling, it's good, keeps you less stressed out. So he's carrying a plaque around him. Since he's the ministry of weights and measures, he has to carry a big club too, to keep everybody in line. That would be the equivalent. So that's his club. So this is equivalent to what your future boss might be. He's going to come in, he's going to beat you occasionally. I'm just making this stuff up. It's good. That it is so. I'll get back to what he does in a minute. So he comes in, and you want to figure out, I want so much gold. Well, so somebody's carrying these bricks. They stack them on here, and you're going to put little nuggets of gold on here. This guy is in charge of keeping up with standards. Now we have National Institute of Standard and Technology. So if you look, that's a federal government. They actually do that. They keep up with what the standard is. They keep standards of seconds, of feet, all this measurements, all this. There's a government agency. Back then, there was probably some evil tyrant that in the Ministry of Weights and Measures. I got to keep remembering that, or I'll forget what that acronym means. So they did that. So they had these bricks. So I'm just making this part up now. So he says, I need to come up with what this is. We know what that a foot is. So I've got this big thing in which I beat people with if they're not proper. So I'll just pound them, so I'll call it a pound. So he says, I'll call it a pound. I have no idea where the word pound came from. Do you know? But it seems like a good story if you said the guy was in charge. He would pound people in the head, and so he called it a pound. So we ended up with a pound. And then the only other thing I could think is a bunch of philosophers are sitting by a stream, and they're contemplating life, watching things go down the river, and they keep sitting there for hours and hours and do absolutely nothing, and then the sun sets, and they got to get up and go around, go back to their house. And so they generated the concept of time. So you get a unit of measure for 3 different things. This is going to come together eventually. It may come together in an awful fashion. And you're probably thinking, did I pay for this class?
Nope.
So you back in the old days, they had, you can look back in old literature, they had units of measure. You know, you read in the Bible, you know, some dude was 900 years old. So they had, you know, maybe it was a little bit messed up on their time. And then, you know, I never figured that one out. So that's why I made up that story. So, you know, so the thing is, was there any problem with the way they functioned? Look, for example, let's say the guy here traded something. He's sitting down in Lucerne, Switzerland or something. He goes up to the top of the Alps and he has some trading to do up here with some guys or girls, and they're trying to figure out how to get stuff. So he takes all of his stuff up there. Is there a problem when he takes it up there? There's gravity, let's say gravity here. Of course, they didn't know anything about gravity except things just fall down if they fell down the hill. So let's say gravity is 32.2 here. Let's say that we're so far up here, gravity was equal to 10. I'm just making that up. You know, say the mountain was so high it was 10. Does that cause a problem? So what's the problem with it?
An extreme difference.
But did they see anything? So, you know, in other words, you take a pound here. So we have weight is equal to mg. I should have said W. Weight is equal to mg. So weight of a pound down here, 1 pound. Take it up the hill. I'm gonna change this to say, let's say it's 3 times less. So it's about 10.9 feet per second squared up here. So it's a third less. So when he takes his brick or his gold up the hill, instead of it being a pound here, it's a pound here. What is it up here?
1/3.
Right. So what kind of problem would that cause? Or would it cause a problem? So the dude with weights and measure, he has a big satchel with all these bricks in it. They're all a pound. And here's the trader. I'm tired of drawing. That's too complex of a character. So he has his satchel full of gold bricks. They both have to go up the hill. So if this guy's carrying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pounds of this, and he's carrying 5 pounds of this, when they put it on this way up here, does it show any difference? They don't know the difference. They have no idea. The only way they could is if they built a thing that was, 30,000 feet long, and one that was really short, and it was balanced, and they took their gold down the hill and put it on here and said, oh, it's heavier on this side. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So they had no idea. They didn't have a concept or a clue. It did not matter to them. They still functioned. Whenever trade happened, they didn't have the internet, so they couldn't trade, on eBay or anything. So they had to be physically face to face, which I'll tell you a story about that in a minute. Face to face, in order to make a transaction. That's the way they existed. Life was fine. They knew what time was. They knew what a weight was. They knew what a length was. They were functioning fine, except for the fact that they often would create kingdoms and kill each other. But besides that, they had a unit of measure. And then what happened is all throughout time, so you're talking about, I really don't know when time started, but then all of a sudden Newton showed up. And so then things got really weird. So here, I'm going to make time go weird now. So here's time. We had a little thin time. We think people are stupid back here, but they're actually not. They actually had much greater powers of observation than we do. You ever sat out in the middle of campus and tried to look at the stars? You can't even see them. So they knew how, if you go look at some of the old ancient sites, you'll find incredible precision about, they knew what the lunar cycle, you know what the lunar cycle is? How long is it?
2 weeks.
19 years. So in other words, the moon will go through its cycle, end up back where it was 19 years from now. So what they had was they passed down information in incredibly accurate form from generation to generation to track this to the degree that if you look at some of these old sites, it's almost amazing. You could look at it and you're like, how did they do this? But they had a huge amount of communication through time. So they had a much greater sense of how to communicate through the generations. Our time frame, when they thought about things, they thought hundreds of years or more. We think about weeks because we're short. We're so buzzing around. We have a distorted sense of time. But what did Newton do? He noticed something. Of course, we all know what he came up with. He came up with this. So for the first time, you have a pound, and you have a foot, and you have a second squared, but you don't know what that is. So his equation, he showed there's some new term here. And of course, all the birth of modern supposed technology occurred after he came up, because the unit F is equal to MA is the birth of the real unit system, the modern unit system. We had them previously, but now he has to come up with something. He has to call it something. What's he going to call it? So this I don't really know why, but there's a unit called a slug. And so if you look in here and you say 1 foot equal 1 slug times 1 feet per second squared. These are what you might call ancient units. Okay, here's what I mean. Okay, so you had a force, you had a length, and you had a time. So an FLT system can be thought of, and it can be generated previous to Newton. If you look at it, this is English. Okay, there's a way they'll call it British gravitational, English engineering. There are several terms of it in which it's a foot and a pound and a second. Okay, so you have force, distance, and time. You have to have something added to it. So this was what they commonly call the derived unit. Derived from F is equal to MA. So if you look at all the units that you see, there's another one that you commonly have seen is SI. What's the difference in the SI? The SI, it has an F, it has an M, and it has an A. But it's a Newton, a kilogram, I guess I'll put the 1 kilogram, meter, second squared. What happened here is these are post-Newton, and in fact, these units, this was the derived unit. You can't, derived, you can't derive this as a derived unit unless you know this. What is a kilogram? A kilogram was generated, remember I said NIST, National Institute of Standards. Kilogram is a certain weight of fluid, and it's, a lot of these distances and everything are based upon water. So it just so happens, a meter is equal to about 39 inches plus some digits that are left over there. Second is the same. kilogram, you'll see, this is something that always bothered me. You ever go look in you see you're buying this barbell and it says 2.2 kilograms on it, right? So what's wrong with that? You might have lifted weights before. I mean, I did in my younger days. I don't do it that much anymore. I go to Planet Fitness. That's not an advertisement. I wouldn't go there if I was you, but I go to the company. So there you go. It's not an advertisement. What's wrong with that when you see a weight and it has kilogram listed on the side?
It's not exactly a pound.
And it's not a weight. It's a mass. So it is true, it's 2.2 kilograms. If you took it to Denver, way less. So maybe it's more accurate. Somebody should put that, you go buy a barbell that says 10 pounds on it. Take that to Denver and you're not lifting 10 pounds. So, but the key is, what is a ancient unit and what is a modern unit? Now, that doesn't mean that, I shouldn't say that in a derogatory way. In the United States, we're kind of trying to walk a bridge down both. The British have stuck to their thing, but the British have kind of let loose. All of Europe, they only use SI. If you go take a class in like statics or something in Europe, they only do SI. There's no other choice. They don't even think there's any. You go to some of the Asian countries, the same thing. We're not using that. That's ancient. Why is it ancient? Well, that's not even spelled right. But the thing is it is really ancient, and we shouldn't get in the mindset that these people back here were stupid. We still don't know how they built the pyramids, and we can't even do them now. So how were they able to do it? They were smarter than we were. Have you ever heard of the site Petra? So it's essentially kind of out there in a very arid area. It turns out that through a bunch of research, there's a guy at Fayetteville who does research. He goes over there, and they determined from the dirt around there that it was a huge, they had piped in tons of water, and it was just this Shangri-La there until one of the dams broke. You know how they got it there? There was a well, like, I don't know if it was 10, 12, 13 miles away. It was just up on a hill. And it turns out that these people, back in those days, the way you make everything was pottery. So if you look at a piece of pottery, I'll try to do the best I can. So you make a pipe, right? And so it's flared on one end. And you can still see these around, even were made in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So you piece of pipe that's pottery, it's actual pottery, and then what you do is you take another one and stick in there. But the thing is when the other pipe goes in there, if you want it to be sealed, you got to put something around it to seal it. Now, here's what happens, and this is why if you look at the way they were actually pretty smart. Okay, so, and I'll get back to the units in a second, what we need, why we need them. If you take a piece of pipe and you make it go really down the hill like that, and you push water down it, eventually the water will fill up to the top edge. If it fills up to the top edge, guess what happens downstream as far as the pressure goes? It goes up, because there's a head above it. If you tilt that pipe back up to a certain angle, and the flow rate goes through it, it never fills because there's enough area for that water to just flow down here with air sitting on top. And it turns out there was a guy at UCLA who did research on this, and he found out that this was 4 degrees. If it popped down more than 4 degrees, down the pipe it would fill up. At that site at Petra, guess what the angle of those pipes were? 4 degrees. Exactly. Every single section. All those miles. So what the people had done is they essentially didn't have to, they just slipped them in there, and the water went down the thing without creating, if it created hydrostatic pressure, what would it do? It would just flow out the back end of that. And so, in essence, and this is not the only case where you see that the people back in those days were a lot smarter than we were. There's a lot of things they did like that even now we can't figure out what they've done. So the water went down there, went for miles and miles and miles, and it constantly flowed. It filled up all these big cisterns everywhere. They had so much water, they piped it over and made these water gardens, and people in the trade, it was sitting right in the trade routes. So all the people used to go there. So it was like the vacation spot. It became big, and you know. And then what happened one day, they figured out that the big spillway that they had made embedded into the rock broke loose, and it just flooded the whole site because they had evidence that things that were here got washed down there. And so then they figured out, oh, okay, that's the case. So back to the point. What is F is equal to MA? It's two things. It's the equation. You know, if you have 2 kilograms and it's going at 5 meters per second, then that's 10 newtons. That's great. Now let's take the numbers off and look at what this really means. It's a unit conversion. Why do you need a unit conversion? You took physics, right? So remember the thing where you had mgh, and then you had something called 1/2 mv squared. Remember all that? So remember, you drop a marble ball, whatever, it goes down, you know, it has potential energy, it turns to kinetic, and you're all happy, and you're like, okay, I figured this out. Now, let's take a look at this. A G times a H is, okay, so let's look at the units. I'm going to stick, if you're okay with it, I'll stick with SI because it's a little less letters. So I got a kilogram, I got a G, a meter per second squared, and then I got another meter. That gives me this gives me that. This gives me the mass, which is the kilogram. Oh, I shouldn't have put no ones. I'm not putting numbers. I'm just looking at the units. Kilograms, meters squared, seconds squared. Now, let's look at this another way. Everything matches, right? Let's look at this another way. mg, what is that? That's just actually a force, right? So in some fluids, well, fluids, yes, but also some physics books, you'll see this listed this way. The weight times the height. And if you have that, then you've got a Newton. Now, you may say, okay, where did that come from? But actually, a force dot a distance. So if you look at these all should have the same units. Force times distance, right? Mm-hmm. So, same thing. Newton meters. So how does a Newton meter end up equaling to a kilogram meter squared second squared? Well, the answer was right back in here. And why did that come from? Well, that came from this, which came from that. It's a unit conversion. You'll never find, ever, will you find a term that has both a force and a mass in it. I can show you list after list. For example, if you're looking at it, density. Did you remember what density was? Mass per unit volume. And that's generally called density. So if you look at it, you know, you're like, okay, I know the units of that. Okay, it's all right. It's a kilogram per meter to the cube. So there's your mass and there's your volume. But do you know it can be represented another way? So you can take a Newton equal to a kilogram in a meters per second squared. But also you can take the Newton second squared by moving this over in a meter and end up with a kilogram. So this sounds bizarre, but a Newton second squared meter to the fourth is a measure of density. Okay, so I'll repeat myself. Kilogram, take a Newton, put it in here, take the second squared. I had a meter, but I had 3 meters already under there. So a meter to the fourth. Does this make any physical sense? Doesn't make any physical sense. But that's the same, these are both exactly the same units. And the reason they're the same units is F is equal to MA. Another one is pressure, okay? Sounds weird. And now this generally won't occur that much in this course, but when you get in fluids, it occurs everywhere. And so you got to be able to take a set of equations, that have, so you got some terms here. You look at the units and they don't match. They're not the same. Well, the reason they're not the same is you've got to use F is equal to MA to switch the units. So these are modern units. They're all bound by F is equal to MA. Now it's true, you can put a number here and a number here and a number here. It should equal. But the units are what we're talking about right now. And this is the birth of the new unit system from Newton. And essentially, when you go through, because if you calculated this stuff and you didn't have this, you wouldn't know what to do next. But now you can move back and forth between a kilogram and a Newton. And if you have a Newton, you can move back to a kilogram. You can move back and forth. You won't find them together. And I can show you charts and charts of them, but they just don't occur. So if you had like pressure, you're used to seeing pressure PSI. You go to check your tire. Well, that's actually, a pound per square inch, which is nothing more than a force over a length squared. Well, it's the same thing that you would see for Newton over a meter squared, commonly called a Pascal. But can you get something else? Okay, I see a force. I don't see a mass in here. There's just a force and then some lengths, right? Mm-hmm. But in fact, you can go back and do something bizarre and tell someone, you can mess with their brain. Oh, I've got a pressure of 10.2, and what would it be? Kilograms. I'm trying to look over here and grab this. Kilogram meter second squared over meter squared, which essentially that unit would be kilogram. Okay, I have over meter second squared. That's a Pascal too. It seems so bizarre. But in fluids, you'll get units pop out like this and like, what do I do with this now? It's supposed to be a Newton meter squared. What do I do? There's a mass here and there's a force there. If you've got those two, the only way to get rid of them is go through F is equal to MA. This is one of the things that, and unless you look back and think about it, there were units back in olden days. They were not there for scientific use. They were there for commercial use and living and basically going and doing trade. That's all they were there for. When Newton came along, it was the birth of a new era. And it's not that long ago. 300 years or so? Something like that. So in the grand scheme of things, you can go find archaeological digs way back, 15, 20,000 BC. So if you look at time, here's where all of time is, and this is kind of where we are. We're just this little part. All this was way back. So we've had longer, time on Earth being supposedly stupid, which in fact, if you look back, there is evidence, and there has been always evidence that essentially people question this from way back before Newton's time. And, there were a couple of libraries that were in, was it Greece or Turkey? Big, huge library that, when the groups of people decide to pillage each other, they burnt the library down. And essentially huge amounts of volume. That's the other thing, when you really look at it, and look at some of the old literature, you'll find something very incredibly interesting. And that is this generational thing. So they were actually carrying things through multiple generations, and the people who were recording history were absolutely anal retentive about making everything perfectly right. If you look at ancient literature that have been discovered and pulled it out to our modern multiple, you'll see it almost exactly word for word. And that's like 6,000 to 7,000 years of time. So they called them scribes or historians. In the Roman, they started calling them historians. You look at that stuff and you're like, oh my God, now we got somebody who wants to just, I'm having stomach ache, so I'm going to tweet something. It's a fact. And you're looking at it and you're like, oh my God, you can't trust anything. So we've entered this new phase where, it's like nobody really cares about, whether what you're saying is actually right. They just care about saying it, maybe to make some extra money or something. So maybe did we ever get away from commerce? Not really. Like if you could be rich and not have to go to school, would you do it? And just, at this point, I guess I'd have to do something. Because you reach a certain age, you've got to do something. So I'd try to find something else if I won the lottery. I don't know if I'd do this, but I'd do something. But anyway, the most totally useless lecture you've ever had, or maybe it was useful, I don't know. But next time we'll start in and do like actual statics and stuff. But units are actually a much ignored thing, and often it can catch you and bite you really hard if you're not paying close attention to stuff. So it is the one thing that is quote unquote so easy to do that people just shove it away and don't even think about it. The other thing I need to talk about, and that is significant digits, because when you get into the solving these problems on this system, they'll say answer it to 3 significant digits. So tell me what your interpretation of that is. So let's say you worked a problem, and here's your answer. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.6789 And so this is, you did a calculation, and just so happened this is the number. This would be really bizarre if you got that number, first of all. But so what is it in 3 significant digits?
1, 2, 3, 10, 4 hours.
Yeah, so the one way you could do it, and then throw away. So when he asks you this, sometimes, let's say, 3 significant. So when he asks you this, he's got some sort of tolerance in there. And you can do that in code with do and float. So if you had this number and you wanted the 3 significant digits, in R you can do something called round, R-O. That's supposed to say round. And then you put your number in. Say that was a variable X, and you put 3, and you could get rid of that. Certain codes have it better. Certain codes don't. Which brings me to another point, and that is I often use MATLAB or Octave when I start solving problems. You will find that in statics, it won't be the first or second week or so, but pretty soon you'll realize there is a repeated, when there is a situation where every single time you can work a problem exactly the same approach, and it works every single time. That's what I feel like I should talk about. When he has it in his book, it's not that way. So, and here's my point. If you meet a problem, say you meet 3 problems, You look at them and you know the same type of problem, and they're done a little different each time, then you're looking at them and you're like, okay, wait a minute, I'm not sure I know exactly how to do that. But what I try to do is I say, well, there is a standardized way, and I use matrices a lot. And so we'll talk about that, and I'll show you how you can get through this. Like when we come to trusses and some of this cabling systems and stuff, there are things you can do in a matrix that work every single time exactly the same way. And so I try to do that a lot. It doesn't necessarily align, but if you look at the example in the book and look at what I'm doing, you put them side by side, you realize actually it's the same thing. It's just his is kind of on the page, and I try to go through it in such a way that it's repeatable, always the same. Basically, that's the way, if I was given a problem like this, that's the way I work it. So I use MATLAB, or actually I use Octave. So have any of you taken that MATLAB or the, and there's another course called Computational Methods, is that it? Now, do y'all do a little MATLAB in that?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
MATLAB and Excel both.
Oh, okay. So I don't use Excel in there, but I use Octave because I'm scared that MATLAB might not come up. But if I can get MATLAB to come up on here, I'll use it. It's essentially the same thing. It works the same way. So, so I think that's probably all I got to say this time. That'll give me a 15-minute break between my next class, which will be right here too. So, any questions? How's the book getting going?
Expensive.
Yeah. Actually, somebody, he was in Fluids, he was looking to try to figure out how to get the ISBN and get it a different way. And I don't know if he was successful or not. So if you are successful at doing that, share it with the class. You know.
PDFs are amazing.
Do I?
PDFs are amazing.
Yeah.
Did you find
So,
circuits?
we'll start in effectively chapter 2 next time,
You have circuits next.
which will be vectors and stuff like that.
I downloaded that because I refuse to lose another one. So you have the actual book, don't you?
Yes,
I can verify this. It's 11. So I think it should be very simple. It is Wild West. Everything.
Oh my God, I hate
Everything that she was saying, Elijah said, it lined up.
You know, I'll ask her when I go, like, say, I already have the left position, we get that pretty soon.
I'll